Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah, let's do it. It's really something else.
We are diving into a transcript today from the channel Hidden Front History, and it explores these really powerful and, I think, truly forgotten psychological currents of World War II.
Hmm.
The sources we're looking at, they detail a story that I think very few people know. It focuses on this group of 27 Japanese women nurses who were captured in the Pacific. This is 1944.
And this is a deep dive where the war isn't really fought with planes or ships. It's fought with something, well, something far more subversive.
Human decency.
Human decency, exactly. Our mission today is to explore this just profound paradox, how unexpected, consistent compassion became a more potent weapon against the ideological structure of Imperial Japan than any explosive ever could have been.
Right, because these nurses, they weren't just soldiers in a sense. They were like living embodiments of a national dogma.
Absolutely. They were conditioned, from childhood to expect American barbarity. They were expecting shame, torture, and a certain violent death if they were ever captured.
Yeah, they were ready for it. I mean, the source material is clear that they often carried small vials of poison. They would have preferred suicide to what they saw as the ultimate shame of falling into enemy hands. They had mentally steeled themselves for the absolute worst kind of cruelty, the kind their own propaganda had promised them.
It was a whole psychological defense mechanism built against physical abuse and humiliation.
And that defense was it was rendered completely useless by what they actually received.
Right. They were met with, professional medical care, dignity, and this consistent adherence to the Geneva Convention.
A document they were taught the Americans just completely ignored.
Totally. And that's the central contradiction, the thing that just utterly shatters their worldview. It's this kindness. Kindness felt more threatening than cruelty ever could.
How does that even work?
Well, if the enemy is capable of such humanity, then their entire foundational belief that Imperial Japan was fighting these barbaric, unprincipled devils, it just crumbles under the weight of daily reality.
So, okay, we need to understand exactly how this process unfolded. How did humane treatment systematically, devastate the core ideological beliefs that fueled an entire nation's fighting spirit?
I think we have to start at the very beginning.
Yeah.
The first contact. The moment those ideological walls met the cold, hard reality of the enemy.
Let's do it. The first sensory assault on their system happens almost immediately. We're in August 1944. The nurses are captured near the Marshall Islands, and they're brought completely exhausted and in tattered uniforms into San Diego Harbor.
And you have to picture the scene. It's just jarring. You've got 27 women, and their senior nurse is a woman named Yuko Nakamura. She's the daughter of a naval officer, so she's trying to maintain this rigid, perfect posture of the Imperial Army Nursing Corps.
Despite weeks at sea, deprivation, and this profound shame they felt just for surviving capture.
Exactly. They are anticipating a hostile, chaotic, maybe even a theatrical reception, something to humiliate them.
But instead, what meets them is just overwhelming order. The harbor is buzzing, gray warships, military trucks, all the bustle. But it's not the chaos they were told to expect from an enemy nation on the brink of collapse.
No, and then they look past the docks. They see the city of San Diego itself.
And that's the first crack in the armor, isn't it? The visual evidence.
It is. San Diego is intact.
Yeah.
The buildings aren't bombed out. The streets are clean. Traffic is orderly. And, you can smell the salt in the air and see palm trees swaying.
Which is so different from what they'd known. For years, these women had only seen a nation mobilizing for total war, resources dwindling, everything for the war effort.
And their propaganda said the enemy was in chaos. But here, the war felt like a distant, almost abstract concept that hadn't even touched the American homeland.
You can just imagine the internal conflict. Their leaders, their commanders, had assured them that the U.S. was starving, that it was on the brink of collapse because of Japanese victories.
And yet, here is this visible, overwhelming evidence of a thriving, organized, deeply prosperous nation.
And the source material really highlights the immediate sensory details that just betrayed that whole official narrative.
Oh, absolutely. The smells are key. They're led into a processing area, and the environment it's antiseptic. It's clean. It's professional.
But then mixed in with that medical smell
is coffee and bacon, these rich, undeniable odors drifting from a nearby mess hall. And then you have the sounds, casual English being shouted, trucks rumbling, radios playing jazz music, and crucially, people laughing.
Laughter. That's a sound of peace, of security. It's a sound of abundance. That casual, relaxed energy just contradicts everything they've been taught to believe.
And Yuko, their senior nurse, she's in this rigid state, whispering instructions to the younger nurses. Things like, keep your eyes down, remember your training, Name, rank, and number only.
They're waiting for the trap to spring. They're anticipating that moment when the mask of civility drops and the promised barbarity finally begins.
This is the cognitive groundwork being laid. They're getting all this contradictory input, and the brain is just desperately trying to reconcile the narrative, Americans are devils, with a sensory input. The devils have excellent sanitation and an abundance of bacon.
It just doesn't compute.
Not at all. And this is why the first step in the process, the simple act of preserving their dignity, was so incredibly devastating to their worldview.
They expected to be publicly humiliated, stripped in front of male guards, the ultimate shame dictated by their code of honor.
But the trap never springs. Instead, they're led towards a medical processing center, and they find only American female personnel waiting for them. WACs and nurses.
And then the Geneva Convention is invoked.
Right. It's not some aggressive interrogation. It's a procedural briefing, and it's delivered by a Japanese-American translator who's wearing a sergeant's uniform.
And he explains, in accented but, perfectly understandable Japanese, that they're going to be treated strictly according to international law.
Now, think about the weight of that single statement. The Geneva Convention was a concept their commanders had explicitly taught them to ignore. They were told it was a sign of Western weakness.
They were told American strength was built on ruthless, unprincipled barbarity.
And now the enemy is citing law, procedure, treating them as legitimate combatants under established international rules. It's a complete paradigm shift.
So when Yuko finally takes off her tattered uniform, the American nurse just hands her a clean cotton robe.
And there are privacy screens. The examination is thorough. They're checking for malnutrition, tropical diseases, injuries, but it's all done with this strict, detached professionalism. It prioritized their physical health, not their public humiliation.
And the sources give us this incredible, specific example. It's about a nurse named Hatsuko. The doctor finds this severe, untreated tropical ulcer on her leg.
Yeah, a really common, debilitating condition for troops who lacked advanced medical supplies in the field.
And the American doctor just immediately starts cleaning it, bandaging it, using supplies like advanced antiseptic and gauze that were far superior to anything these Japanese nurses had seen in months.
And Hatsuko, she can't rationalize this. This act of genuine care doesn't fit the narrative. So she manages to ask in broken English, why? Why are you helping us?
That question, that's the heart of the whole dilemma right there. It's an admission that this act completely defies their entire moral framework.
And the doctor's reply is the first truly devastating blow to Imperial ideology, all because of its sheer simplicity and its moral consistency. He just says, "It's my job. You're under our care now."
No malice, no political lecture, no attempt to gain leverage.
Nothing. It's just professional medical protocol overriding nationality. It's a display of moral integrity that contradicts every single thing they believed about their enemy's inherent character.
That's profound. The lack of an emotional or political agenda behind the kindness, it just made it impervious to their psychological defenses.
Exactly. And this leads directly to what the sources call the revolutionary act of cleanliness. They were expecting some kind of public, degrading dousing.
But they were given private hot showers.
With real, clean, streaming water. And the sources really emphasized the soap, these thick bars that smell distinctly of lavender. For years in the field, these women had known only shortages, recycled water, poor hygiene.
This simple, plentiful commodity wasn't just about hygiene. It was a potent symbol of American material power, but also of a willingness to grant them basic human dignity.
And many of them wept silently. Not out of fear, but out of the sheer relief of clean water and privacy.
And then comes the clothing. This is the detail that Yuko really focuses on in her diary. They don't get standardized, dehumanizing prison uniforms.
No, they receive these soft, clean cotton dresses and underwear. Items that were objectively better quality than the thin, rough uniforms their own military had provided for them.
And her internal struggle is just laid bare in that diary entry. She writes something like, "They give us better clothing than our own military provided? I don't understand. Is this part of a greater humiliation to come?"
She can't process the kindness as sincere. She has to interpret it as a highly sophisticated, elaborate trap, some kind of psychological manipulation designed to weaken their spirit before the real torture begins.
It's just so telling. If the Americans had acted like the devils they were promised.
The nurses could have maintained their resolve. They could have died as martyrs to the Imperial cause. Their worldview would have been confirmed.
But because the Americans were not devils, because they acted with this this almost unsettling, consistent dignity, the nurses were forced to confront a terrifying possibility.
That the source of the lies and the true source of betrayal might have been much, much closer to home.
So the initial shock is complete, but, a single day of decency could still be dismissed as a fluke, maybe an elaborate first step in some grand deception.
Right, you could still rationalize it. But the true demolition of that ideological structure happens when the decency becomes routine. And that's exactly what happens when they're transferred to Fort Lincoln.
The permanent POW facility in North Dakota?
Exactly. This is where a pattern gets established, a pattern that the old, harsh imperial ideology simply could not sustain.
So this is the move from that high-stress, immediate moment of capture to the long-term, predictable routine of the American interior. Fort Lincoln is a world away from the tropics.
Oh, yeah. They're experiencing a crisp Midwest autumn. And the daily routine there was meant to be orderly, governed by consistent rules. And this predictability, that was the real psychological weapon.
And the first routine that hits them is what the sources call the mess hall shock.
This becomes the single greatest material killer of Japanese wartime propaganda. They enter the hall, and the smell is not just bacon anymore. It's this rich, overwhelming abundance that just speaks of a functioning, well-oiled society.
And can we talk about the detail of the meal? Because the sources are very specific.
Please. Each nurse gets a tray piled high. We're talking roast chicken, mashed potatoes with thick gravy, buttery green beans, a fried roll with butter, a cup of fruit cocktail, and all of it with a large glass of whole milk.
The reports are explicit about this. That was more food on one single tray than many of them had seen in an entire week during their deployment.
And yet, what do?
They initially refuse to eat. They just sit there, rigidly hands folded, waiting for the other shoe to drop.
They suspect it's poison. Or that this level of generosity is just a cruel tease before starvation begins. It has to be a trick.
And Senior Nurse Yuko actually asks the American nurse supervisor why they're giving enemy prisoners such good food when surely America must be rationing all its basic goods.
And the supervisor's response is that shockwaves we were talking about earlier. She looks genuinely confused by the question.
Yeah.
She says, this is standard mess hall food. Everyone on base eats like this.
And she admits, yeah, there's some rationing for things like sugar and rubber, but she says, we have plenty of food.
And that casually delivered piece of information just exposed the fundamental lie about America's capabilities and resources.
The enemy wasn't weak. It wasn't chaotic or starving.
No. The enemy was strong, orderly, and possessed this vast functional supply chain that sustained even its prisoners better than Japan sustained its own fighting troops.
Okay, but hold on. Why was that more devastating than if they had been starved? I mean, if they'd been given meager rations, it would have just confirmed the narrative, right? The enemy is cruel.
That's the core of it. That's the psychological devastation. Starvation would have confirmed their patriotism, the righteousness of their struggle. But abundance. Abundance forces them to realize two things at the same time.
Okay.
One, their own leaders had lied to them about the enemy's strength. And two, that their own immense suffering in the field was, in many ways, unnecessary. They were fighting a powerful, functional enemy based on a false premise of that enemy's weakness.
That betrayal is far more painful than any physical cruelty could have been.
Exactly. And it's the small kindnesses built into this routine of abundance that really start to break through that rigidity. Like with Nurse Chio, the youngest one. Her stomach had shrunk, and she tries to apologetically return her tray because she can't finish the massive portion.
And the server, through the translator, just smiles and says something like, keep it for later if you'd like.
Right. She hands her a napkin to wrap the roll in the fruit. Food was not a weapon. It was simply treated as a basic human right. And that stood in stark contrast to their own experience in the Imperial military, where food, dignity, supplies, that was all reserved for those of rank.
This abundance continues into their living conditions, too. They're moved into real barracks with real beds.
Mattresses, sheets, pillows. A luxury they just assumed was reserved only for high-ranking officers in the Japanese military.
And the explanation from the American WAC sergeant just reinforces this theme of consistency. She says, these are standard accommodations for prisoners here. Your prisoners, not criminals.
So the Geneva Convention, which was once this abstract, discarded concept, it becomes a daily, tangible reality that governs the temperature of their barracks and the quality of their sheets.
And crucially, they are treated as professionals whose time has a value. They work as medical personnel in the camp hospital, and they get paid 75 cents per day in camp script,
which they can use at the canteen for things like chocolate or toiletries or writing materials.
And this system of work and compensation is just so anti-imperial in its concept?
Completely. Their duty in the Imperial military was uncompensated labor. It was a matter of honor and duty only. So to receive pay, even in camp script, it reinforces this idea that the individual has inherent economic worth separate from the collective state or their imperial duty.
It's a foundational concept of democracy delivered through a camp canteen.
You could say that.
Yeah.
So the real weapon wasn't a policy of cruelty. It was a policy of boring, predictable, institutionalized ethical consistency. Yuko starts observing that the predictability itself is the threat.
No arbitrary punishments, no surprise inspections. They're addressed as nurse. The Americans operated by rules, and they actually followed them.
But the psychological cost that arrived with the mail. As this routine of abunding settled in, censored letters from home finally started to arrive, and they carried the painful truth of a suffering homeland.
The sources detail this agonizing guilt that starts to set in among the nurses. Nurse Aiko, for example, she learns that her hometown near Osaka was heavily bombed.
And that her mother was surviving by grinding sweet potato vines into paste and mixing it with rice husks.
So Aiko literally could not finish a plate of beef stew because of this overwhelming, just obscene sense of guilt. The sheer contrast between her heated, safe, and well-fed reality and the reality of her mother starving on husks, it made the American abundance feel like a personal betrayal of her homeland.
And this contrast went beyond just basic living. It reached into medical technology. Nurse Fumiko, working the camp hospital, she's observing the Americans using penicillin and sulfa drugs.
And she realizes that in the Japanese military, their wounded died constantly from infections they couldn't treat. But here, the Americans were saving limbs that would have just been amputated a few months prior in her own service.
The enemy was superior, not just in the technology of war, but in the technology of preserving life. This created an ideological tension that was just almost impossible to bear.
They're living in comfortable barracks, they have access to life-saving drugs, all while their family back home is starving.
And if the Americans weren't the monsters they were promised, why were they fighting? These questions, multiplying in the safety and quiet of their captivity, they bordered on treason. But they were the only rational response to the evidence in front of them.
So with their physical needs met and the reality of American abundance just completely undeniable, the conflict moves. It moves entirely inward.
Exactly. We are now in what the sources call the invisible war. The conflict waged not with bullets, but with this profound cognitive dissonance. It all stems from this humane treatment that challenged their lifelong narrative.
This is where the analysis in the sources really just explodes. They were prepared for physical torture, right? They had built these mental defenses for abuse.
But they had zero defense against kindness and dignity. Your earlier phrase, the torture of cognitive dissonance, that perfectly summarizes what they were facing.
Because if you define torture as the destruction of the self.
And the American behavior was the ultimate form of psychological warfare. Yuko's struggle in her diary just captures this perfectly. She wrote something like, "I was taught that Americans were devils who would torture us if captured. Yet here I am, healthy, unharmed, and eating better than my family."
Which is the lie. What I was taught, or what I now experience.
And if one is a lie, what else might be untrue?
That quote is just incredible. The idea that kindness is a sophisticated trap. I mean, can we dig into what that implies about their prior conditioning? It means their leaders, by preaching absolute loyalty, demanded intellectual rigidity.
Yes. Any deviation, any evidence that ran contrary to the narrative was a threat to the entire spiritual, political, and military structure of the nation.
So the very foundation of their worldview, that the emperor and the state were infallible, it began to crumble because the empirical evidence of their senses contradicted it every single day.
It was a crisis of faith. And for someone like Aiko, whose brother died at Midway fighting savages, that crisis was tragic and deeply personal.
If the Americans are consistent, moral human beings capable of this ethical behavior, then what was his sacrifice for? That thought, it's borderline blasphemy against the state and her family's honor.
It implies that his death was not only tragic, but maybe meaningless. That he died fighting an enemy who was perhaps no less human than he was.
And you see the youngest, Nurse Chio, suffering this incredible guilt precisely because she was adapting.
She confessed to the others, "Sometimes I forget to hate them. Does this make me a bad Japanese?" The simple acts of forgetting to hate, of seeing the enemy as just people fulfilling their duty, that generated this internal sense of profound disloyalty that was agonizing for her.
And this struggle was so intense that it actually manifested physically, in these ideological divisions within the barracks at night. The 27 nurses broke down into 3 distinct, identifiable factions.
Yeah, the sources outline them very clearly. First, you had the traditionalists. They were often led by the most senior nurses, like a woman named Salito, and they just doubled down on suspicion.
They insisted the kindness was purely psychological warfare.
Right. Designed to break their loyalty so the Americans could use them for propaganda, they maintained strict Japanese customs, rigid bowing rituals, refusal to speak English, insisting on wearing what was left of their old uniforms. It was like a mental life raft in this sea of confusing mercy.
Then you had the pragmatist.
Led by Yuko, who was trying to hold everyone together, they focused purely on survival and maintaining cohesion. They adapted outwardly, they learned English, they used the amenities, but they reserved deep internal judgment. They prioritized unity while they waited for the war's outcome.
And finally, the questioners. The most dangerous group, philosophically speaking.
Definitely. These were the ones, often the younger nurses, or those like Fumiko, who had an existing religious faith, some were Catholic, that gave them an alternative moral framework that transcended nationalism,
They were the ones who dared to speak the unspeakable.
challenging the infallibility of the emperor and the state, based on the objective evidence they encountered every single day.
And the crucial debate that the sources highlight really shows this ideological fracture. It's between Salito, the traditionalist, and Fumiko, the questioner.
Right. Salito argues that their doubts are treasonous, that the enemy has succeeded in planting these seeds of betrayal, and they have to hold the line.
And Fumiko's counterargument is just intellectually brilliant. It separates subjective experience from objective reality.
She asks Salito, is truth determined by how badly we're treated? If they tortured us until we confessed, would their bombs be any less real? She forces them to separate the physical facts of the war, that Japan is losing, that the cities are being destroyed, from their subjective treatment. American kindness doesn't change the reality of the bombing, but it radically changes the perceived reason for the fighting.
And while this ideological war is raging inside the barracks, these small, mundane human interactions are slowly chipping away at the barrier between the prisoners and the guards.
Yeah, these weren't grand gestures. They were just accidents of shared humanity.
Like the American nurses making an effort to learn basic Japanese phrases.
Deju, or it's all right, or simple greetings. And there's this story of the elderly American cook who, noticing the nurses were avoiding some of the unfamiliar Western foods, takes the time to make them a crude approximation of seasoned rice.
Communicating recognition and respect through food, not language.
Exactly.
Okay.
Or Yuko's infected wisdom tooth. She's treated by an American dentist who works carefully to save the tooth, not just yank it out. And she notes the concentration on his face and realizes his hands would treat a wounded American with the exact same careful attention.
That professional recognition, the shared purpose of medicine, was a massive factor.
Huge. Yuko writes that the true danger of captivity wasn't what they might do to her body, but what they were doing to her beliefs. Each small kindness, she writes, is a cut against the armor we have built.
The irony is just complete. The enemy was becoming human, face by individual face, and this transformation was more painful than any physical abuse could have been.
But the moral framework that truly cemented all of this was provided by Captain Lillian Miller, the camp commander. She actually revealed that her own brother was killed at Guadalcanal.
A loss directly attributable to the Japanese military.
And yet she insisted on fair treatment for the nurses, citing the Geneva Convention. And her justification was key for the nurses' conversion. She said, I won't dishonor his sacrifice by becoming what we're fighting against.
Wow, that's moral consistency.
It is. Her ethical baseline transcended personal vengeance or national loss. It showed the nurses that Americans didn't just pretend to have principles, they actually adhered to them, even toward the enemy, and even at a high personal cost.
And that distinction principles, holding firm under duress, must have seemed like an unbelievable strength compared to the Imperial mandate, which required total, unwavering allegiance regardless of facts or ethics.
If the previous sections showed the slow decay of ideology through routine decency, this next part details the final, devastating blow.
Which was the realization that the enemy fought to preserve the lives of Japanese soldiers.
The pivotal moment occurs in February 1945. The nurses are gathered in the recreation hall to watch a mandatory newsreel. They're anticipating the standard, bombastic American propaganda designed to demoralize them.
And instead, they're shown this black and white footage of American field hospitals.
And they're treating newly captured Japanese soldiers on light, They just watched, transfixed, as American doctors perform surgery, administer blood transfusions, and change bandages with the exact same dedication given to American wounded.
And the room is just silent when the lights come up. As medical professionals themselves, the nurses recognized the protocol. They knew the intensity and commitment involved in that kind of surgery.
This wasn't staged. This was systematic care.
And the ideological fallout is just catastrophic.
Completely. Japanese ideology mandated that wounded soldiers must die rather than face capture or shame. And here was undeniable visual proof that surrender did not mean shame. It meant professional medical care.
And that for the Americans, medical ethics transcended nationality and battle lines.
Right. And Nurse Yuko, the one whose brother died fighting, she voiced the defining question that just cut to the heart of their entire military system.
She asks, how many died needlessly? How many could have lived if they had surrendered when wounded?
And that realization wasn't just about American kindness. It exposed the deep, self-destructive nature of their own military system, which prioritized dogma over the preservation of life.
For the nurses specifically, this must have been a massive violation of their professional oaths. They took oaths to preserve life.
But they served a system that viewed the capture and survival of the wounded as a moral failing. The American approach, which valued the individual life, even an enemy life, in a way the Imperial system did not, was perceived by Yuko as a different kind of strength.
And this ideological conflict came to a head in March of 45, right? When an event completely crystallized this terrifying new reality for Yuko.
It did. A Japanese captain from the men's POW section, overwhelmed by the shame of capture, attempted suicide. He was rushed to the operating room at the camp hospital.
And Yuko, because of her rank and skill, was called in.
When she entered the OR, the American team was already working frantically to save this man who had tried to fulfill the cultural mandate of dying with honor. The head surgeon, without even missing a beat, just looks up and says, "Nurse, we need another pair of hands. Will you assist?"
And her professional training just took over instantly.
Completely. She worked side by side with the enemy team in perfect synchronization to save the life of her own countrymen. They saved the man who had tried to die.
So she performed an act of professional loyalty healing that was simultaneously an act of treason against the cultural mandate of the imperial state.
And the operation was a success. The aftermath was simple and profoundly shocking. The American doctor just said, "Thank you for your help. You're an excellent nurse."
No lecture, no political commentary, just shared professional purpose and recognition of her skill.
In Yuko's diary entry that night, it captures the entire premise of this deep dive. She notes that the Americans viewed it only as a life saved. They celebrated it without any political or national consideration, she writes. They seem to recognize a humanity that exists beyond nationality, beyond the boundaries of war.
They fought to save a life, even a shamed one.
And this leads to her final, definitive conclusion on the matter. This is not weakness as we were taught. Perhaps it's a different kind of strength. Kindness cut deeper than cruelty ever could have.
By showing mercy to Japanese wounded, the Americans delivered the most devastating blow to the ideology that fueled the war effort.
Because they proved its foundational assertion, the enemy's inherent barbarity, to be unequivocally false.
And when Yuko shared this experience with the other nurses, it was the final trigger, the ideological collapse, even among the traditionalists.
Salito, the one who had been so rigid in maintaining her old customs, she finally broke down.
And her question is the final verdict on the entire imperial ideology, isn't it? It marks the moment the last psychological defenses just failed.
It does, she asked. If they save the lives of our soldiers, while our own leaders tell us to die rather than be captured, who is truly the enemy of the Japanese people?
And the silence that followed was the answer.
The silence was the answer. They realized the enemy was not the American soldier, but the dogma that demanded their own death and obscured the reality of the outside world.
So the war ends August 1945. But for these nurses, the surrender doesn't bring relief. It brings a new, acute fear that immediately replaces the old one.
The fear of repatriation.
They feared being viewed with suspicion, assumed to have been broken or brainwashed, because Japanese culture viewed capture not just as a failing, but as a profound, almost inheritable shame.
They felt contaminated. Contaminated by the humanity they had experienced and the knowledge they had gained.
And the personal consequences were just tragically real. The sources document that Nurse Yuko's father, he had written to her that he told the neighbors she had died honorably at my post.
Her physical survival was, culturally, a source of shame for her family, a betrayal of the ideal.
So when they finally returned in 1946, they sail into a devastated Yokohama harbor. The city's in ruins. They see starving children, rubble everywhere.
And they're instantly forced to confront this immense gulf between their well-fed captivity, the hot showers, the beef stew, the penicillin, and the immense suffering of their homeland.
Their knowledge of advanced medical techniques, of food abundance, of the moral consistency of the enemy, it made them instant outsiders.
They were living proof that Japan had not only lost the war, but that its leaders had fundamentally misrepresented the enemy.
And so many of them chose silence to navigate this new reality. They learned to omit the deeper, more disturbing truths of their captivity, the American humanity, just to survive these strained homecomings in a post-war reality where the culture of shame still lingered so strongly.
Unfortunately, not all of them were able to reconcile this profound cognitive shift. The sources note that 3 of the original 27 nurses committed suicide later in life.
Unable to integrate their profound transformation, the acceptance of the humane enemy with the crushing post-war Japanese reality, and the pervasive stigma that was attached to their survival.
Others hid their POW status for years, fabricating alternate wartime histories to avoid the stigma of being contaminated by the enemy's kindness.
But for the majority who survived and adapted, the perspective they gained became the foundation for these incredibly successful professional lives.
Right. Decades later, at a reunion in Kyoto in 1975, you see the lasting legacy of that captivity. It forced them to reevaluate their entire professional purpose.
And Yuko, who is now the director of nursing at a major Tokyo hospital, had incorporated American medical techniques into her practice. Her conclusion reflected her entire journey.
She said, "The war taught me that knowledge has no nationality. Healing is universal." She became a modernizer, based on the lessons she learned from the enemy's superior ethical and scientific structures.
And Nurse Chio, the youngest one, who struggled with the guilt of forgetting to hate.
She eventually married an American medical student who stayed in Japan to practice medicine, and she noted that her family, who were initially resistant, eventually came to judge him strictly as a person, not as an American devil.
She said, "This is what captivity taught us first, to see beyond labels."
The personal lesson became a professional and a familial philosophy.
And the final, beautiful summary of their experience brings us all the way back to that very first sensory shock in San Diego, to the symbol of basic human dignity that ultimately shattered an empire's narrative.
The soap analogy.
The soap analogy.
Yuko's reflection on that first day summarizes the entire deep dive. The soap they received, it was just basic hygiene to the Americans, a mundane commodity. But to the Japanese nurses, she said, it was revolutionary evidence that the enemy saw us as human beings deserving of dignity. That recognition changed everything.
It was the ultimate contradiction to the ideology of dehumanization.
The conclusion is just undeniable. Their captivity was a lesson that professional ethics and humanity, when they're consistently applied, can transcend battle lines and ideological fanaticism.
Mercy, in this specific historical instance, was the most powerful force in the world. It didn't just save their lives, it forced them to redefine loyalty, truth, and the very concept of strength itself.
So to recap the core dynamic here, the expected cruelty would have solidified their resolve. The actual compassion demolished it. The true psychological devastation was the forced realization that their ideological foundation, the idea of fighting barbaric devils, was false.
And the Americans delivered the most devastating blow to the ideology that fueled the war effort simply by adhering to their own ethical codes.
Exactly.
So what does this all mean for us?
I think it means that if we view this history through the lens of individual dignity, we realize that sometimes the most profound resistance to hatred isn't fighting back. It's not sinking to the enemy's level. It's simply maintaining your own ethical principles, your professional standards, and your commitment to a shared humanity.
That is a powerful and a very difficult lesson. The stronger side is not always the one with the biggest weapons,
but the one whose institutions can afford to treat the enemy with predictable, ethical consistency.
And this recognition of a shared humanity may be our most powerful tool for lasting peace. So I'll leave you with this thought. In today's divided world, what small, consistent, almost mundane act of dignity might shatter the preconceptions held by someone on the other side?
That is the true power of this hidden front of history, the quiet subversion of malice through mercy.